In the autumn of 1934, in a cattle and wheat county called Harlan Flats, in the eastern reaches of the Texas Panhandle, the First Consolidated Bank of Tascosa held delinquent notes on 63 properties and had begun calling them in. The drought that had settled over the southern plains that year was not the worst in memory, but it arrived on top of 2 years of falling commodity prices and a federal loan program that had never quite reached the people who needed it most. Wheat that had sold for 80 cents a bushel in 1929 was fetching 22 cents in the fall markets of 1934. Cattle prices had recovered slightly from their floor the previous spring, but only slightly, and the cost of feed had not come down with them. The land itself had begun to move in the wind. The topsoil that 3 generations of farming families had worked into something approaching arable ground was lifting from the fields in sheets and drifting against fence lines and barn walls and the eastern faces of every building in the county. People called it the Black Blizzard season, and the name was not poetic. It was descriptive. The sky turned the color of a cast-iron skillet on the days the wind came from the southwest, and afterward the dust lay on windowsills and kitchen tables, and in the creases of a man's knuckles, regardless of how many times he washed his hands. Harlan Flats itself was a town of approximately 940 people in that autumn, built along a low ridge above the Canadian River breaks, where the caprock fell away to the east in a series of red-walled canyons that were spectacular to look at and largely useless to farm. The town had a grain elevator, a cattle pens operation, 2 banks, one of which had failed in 1931, a feed store, a hardware concern, a dry goods operation, a drugstore with a soda counter, 3 churches, a school that ran through the 10th grade, and the offices of the Harlan Flats Courier, which published on Thursdays. The main street was unpaved. The courthouse square 2 blocks north of it was paved with brick, and on dry, windy days the dust that blew across it settled in the mortar lines, and the whole surface turned the color of the land around it. The people who ran Harlan's in 1934 were not cruel people, by and large. They were institutional people. They operated within systems that had been in place before them, and that they expected would continue after them. And the system put in place that autumn called for the collection of debts that had become uncollectible by the ordinary means of patience and goodwill. The bank was not a villain. The bank was a mechanism, and mechanisms operate according to their design. A man named Elias Cord had been farming 430 acres 12 miles east of town since the spring of 1919, and by September of 1934, he owed the First Consolidated Bank of Tascosa the sum of $1,240, and the bank had sent him a letter telling him that the note was due in full by the 15th of October. Elias Cord had read that letter at his kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, while his wife stood at the stove and the 2 youngest of their 4 children ate their breakfast, and the expression on his face when he set the letter down was not panic. It was the particular stillness of a man who has been expecting news like this and finds when it arrives that he is not as prepared for it as he believed. Elias Cord was born in 1889 in a town called Ringling, in the Arbuckle Mountains of southern Oklahoma, the second of 5 children born to a man named Harold Cord, who worked as a farrier and kept a small number of hogs on 20 acres of rocky bottomland along the Washita River. Harold Cord was not a prosperous man, but he was a consistent one, and consistency was the thing he managed to pass on to his children more reliably than anything else. Elias went to school through the 7th grade, which was 2 grades further than his father had gone, and at 14 he began working summers with a cattle outfit that ran longhorn crosses up through the nations toward the Kansas railheads. By 17 he was doing it full-time. By 20 he had saved $412 and had the kind of physical confidence that comes not from fights won, but from difficult work done repeatedly over time. He met a woman named Clara Baines in the summer of 1914 at a church social in Elk City, Oklahoma. Clara was the daughter of a wheat farmer and the youngest of three sisters, and she was 21 years old and had opinions about things that she expressed clearly and without embarrassment, which was not common in that place and time, and which Elias Cord found remarkable. They were married in February of 1915 in a ceremony at the Elk City Baptist Church, attended by 47 people, and within a year their first child, a son named Roy, was born. The decision to move to the Texas Panhandle came in the spring of 1918, when a man Elias had worked cattle with told him about a parcel of land available east of Harlan Flats at a price that was, for that era, reasonable. The land had been opened to homestead filing in 1908, and the original claimant had proved it up, and then sold it to a grain speculator from Amarillo who had let it go fallow. The soil in that section ran deep and dark over red hardpan, and the annual rainfall averaged 14 inches, which was not generous but was workable if a man was careful about what he planted and when. Elias borrowed $200 from Clara's father, added it to the $380 he had saved by then, and in April of 1919, at the age of 29, he filed on 430 acres in Section 14 of Harlan County and began to build. The first 2 years were the years that either made a man or broke him on that land. Elias and Clara lived in a 2-room frame structure he built in the first month. They spent the summer of 1919 breaking ground on the eastern 200 acres with a team of 2 draft horses he had bought on credit from a neighbor. They planted winter wheat that October and waited. The spring of 1920 brought adequate rain, and the wheat came in at 31 bushels per acre, which at the prices of that year returned enough money to pay the farm supply account and the interest on the borrowed money and purchase a second team of horses and a proper 2-bottom plow. That was the season Elias understood that the land was going to produce for him if he worked it correctly. And from that understanding forward, he worked it with a consistency that his father would have recognized. By 1926, the farm was running 400 acres in production, split between winter wheat and grain sorghum, with a small cattle pen operation on the west edge of the property, where Elias ran 20 to 30 stocker cattle through on grass during the spring and summer months before selling them to the Harlan Flats cattle pens in the fall. The family had grown. Roy was 10. A daughter named Alice was 8. A second son, Thomas, was 5. The youngest, a daughter named June, had been born in 1924. The original 2-room frame house had been expanded to 6 rooms, with a proper kitchen and a sleeping porch on the south side that Clara used in the summer months when the nights were still warm enough to sleep outside. There was a barn large enough to stable 4 horses and store a full season's equipment. There was a working windmill. There was a root cellar stocked each fall with enough preserved food to carry the family through 6 months of hard weather. The financial picture in 1926 was not comfortable, but it was ordered. The original loan from Clara's father had been repaid in full in 1923. The farm carried an operating note at the First Consolidated Bank of Tascosa that ran to approximately $300 annually, renewed each spring, secured against the crop. The land itself carried a mortgage of $1,400 that had been restructured twice since 1919 and had an original term running to 1938. The mortgage payment was $60 per quarter, due on the 1st of January, April, July, and October. Then the prices fell. They fell first in 1929 and continued falling through 1930 and 1931 in a way that was not correctable by hard work or careful management, because the problem was not a failure of production. It was a failure of markets. The wheat came in fine in 1930. It came in fine in 1931. The sorghum did what it had always done. The cattle moved through the pens and went to Amarillo, and the check that came back was less than the cost of the feed and the shipping and Elias sat at his kitchen table in the fall of 1931 and looked at a set of numbers that did not add up regardless of how many times he worked through them. He had stopped making full quarterly mortgage payments in July of 1932. He had made partial payments, $30 in October of 1932, to $40 in January of 1933. Nothing in April of 1933, because the spring wheat check had not covered the feed account and the operating note both, and he had chosen the operating note because without it, there would be no next season at all. By the fall of 1933, he was 8 months behind on the mortgage, and the bank had sent 2 letters, and a representative named Gerald Purcell had driven out from town in a company Ford to sit across the kitchen table from Elias and explain, in language that was careful and not unkind, that the bank needed him to bring the account current or enter into a formal forbearance agreement that would add the arrears to the principal and extend the loan term at a higher interest rate. Elias had signed the forbearance agreement in November of 1933. The new terms brought the arrears, $480 by that point, into the principal, and the adjusted monthly payment went from $60 per quarter to $85, and the interest rate moved from 4.5% to 6%. Elias had signed it because the alternative offered in the same sitting was foreclosure, and he had signed it with the belief that the prices would come back, and that the new terms, though harder, were survivable. They were not survivable at 22 cents a bushel. By September of 1934, the accumulated shortfall on the revised note stood at $1,240, and the letter Gerald Purcell had sent out was not a preliminary inquiry. It was a formal demand. The note was called. The full amount was due by the 15th of October. If it was not paid, the First Consolidated Bank of Tascosa would begin foreclosure proceedings under the terms of the restructured agreement, and the property at Section 14 would be offered at public auction not less than 30 days after the filing of the notice. Clara had read the letter after Elias. She had set it back on the table and gone to the window and stood there for a long moment looking out at the yard and the barn and the line of cottonwoods along the creek bed that she had planted herself from saplings in 1921. Then she had come back to the table and sat down and said, "What do we do first?" Not as a question, as a statement of intent. She was 41 years old, and she had put 15 years of her life into that ground, and she did not intend to mourn before the thing was settled. Elias had gone to the bank the following Monday. He had driven the 8 miles into Harlan Flats in the farm truck, which needed a new front tire that he had not been able to buy, and he had walked into the First Consolidated Bank of Tascosa and asked to see the branch manager, a man named Douglas Fisk. Fisk was a 53-year-old banker who had grown up in Lubbock and come to Harlan Flats in 1921 to manage the branch that had been opened that year by the Consolidated Banking Group out of Amarillo. He was not a dishonest man. He was not motivated by personal malice toward Elias Cord or toward any of the 60 other families whose notes he was calling in that autumn. He was motivated by a directive from the Amarillo Home Office that had come down in August instructing branch managers to reduce their delinquent portfolio by not less than 40% before the end of the calendar year. And he was proceeding accordingly. Fisk had received Elias in his office, which was a spare room behind the teller cages with a desk and 2 wooden chairs and a framed photograph of the Amarillo skyline on the wall. He had listened to what Elias had to say, which was that the farm was productive, that the land was good, that the prices were going to come back, and that if the bank would extend the note another 18 months, he would have the arrears current by the spring of 1936. Fisk had listened to all of this with the patience of a man who had heard it many times already that season. And then he had explained with equal patience that the bank was not in a position to extend additional forbearance on a note that had already been restructured once. and that the demand letter stood as issued, and that the full amount of $1,240 was due by the 15th of October. The amount was not in question. The question was whether anyone in Harlan County had $1,240 to lend a wheat farmer in the autumn of 1934, and the answer to that question was the same as the answer to most questions about money in that county in that season. Nobody did. Elias had driven back out to the farm and told Clara what Fisk had said, and then he had done what men of his temperament do when institutions close their doors. He had gone looking for a different door. He had written a letter to the Federal Farm Credit Administration's office in Amarillo describing his situation and asking whether emergency loan funds were available. The reply came back in 2 weeks informing him that the FCA's emergency allocation for the Texas district had been exhausted in the previous fiscal year and that applications for the next fiscal year's funding would be accepted beginning in January of 1935. This was not helpful. His deadline was October 15th. He had gone to see a man named Aubrey Thorne, who farmed 3 sections north of him and who was known to have some money set aside. Thorne had heard him out over coffee in the Thorne kitchen and then said that he was sorry, that he wished he could help, but that his own position was not as solid as people imagined, and that he had his own obligations to meet. This was probably true. Elias believed it was true. He thanked Thorne and drove home. He had gone to see Reverend Haas at the First Lutheran Church in town, not because he expected the church to have that kind of money, but because Haas was a man who knew everyone in the county and sometimes knew things that were not obvious. Haas had been sympathetic and had mentioned a community assistance fund that the 3 churches jointly administered. But the fund's current balance was $212, and it was already committed to 3 families facing medical emergencies. Haas had said he would pray on it, and Elias had thanked him and meant it, and the answer remained $1,028 short. There was a man in Amarillo, a private lender named Corwin, who was known to make emergency loans at high interest to distressed farm properties. Elias had telephoned Corwin's office from the hardware store in town, using their telephone, and had spoken to a man who said he was Corwin's associate, and who asked a number of questions about the property and its valuation, and then said that Corwin would be willing to advance $1,000 against a second lien on the property at 18% annual interest with a balloon payment due in 12 months. Elias had done the arithmetic on that arrangement in the hardware store parking lot, sitting in the truck, and the arithmetic had shown him that it would cost him the farm in 12 months instead of in October and in worse engine, because he would have paid out the interest on top of everything else. He had not called Corwin's office back. By the first week of October, with 14 days remaining before the foreclosure demand deadline, Elias Cord had exhausted every door he knew how to find. He had not told Roy, who was 18 and working the harvest, or Alice, who was 16 and attending school in town. He had told Clara everything, because Clara was not a person you concealed the truth from, and because he had never tried to. At night, after the children were asleep, they sat at the kitchen table and went through the numbers again, as though repetition might change them. And then they sat in silence, and the wind moved outside the windows with its cargo of dust. And neither of them said the thing they were both thinking, which was that after 15 years the land was about to pass out of their hands. John Wayne rode into Harlan Flats on the morning of October 8, 1934, on a sorrel quarter horse that he had ridden the last 40 miles from a cattle operation near the town of Canadian to the southeast. He came up the main street from the south end, moving at an easy walk, the horse's hooves raising small puffs of the red dust that lay over everything that October, and he did not look like a man arriving. He looked like a man who had simply continued moving until he happened to stop here. He was 40 years old that autumn, and carried the weight of those years the way certain men do, not as accumulated damage, but as settled mass. Tall in the saddle, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of square jaw and deep-set eyes that people noticed, and then felt they had seen before, though they usually had not. He wore a high-crowned Stetson in dark, felt that had seen considerable weather. A cavalry-style shirt in faded blue, a leather vest the color of saddle leather that had been resoled more than once, and working boots with low-heeled practical spurs of the kind a man wears when he is working cattle on rough country rather than performing. He moved with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had learned, at some point in the past, that hurrying rarely improved an outcome and occasionally made things worse. His name was John Wayne, and he was known in the eastern Panhandle country, not as a figure of legend, but as a figure of known quantity. He had spent 20 years in and out of the region, working cattle for the Big R outfits during the boom years, running his own small operation for a period in the 1920s, before selling it off and moving to the freight and trading, work that suited him better as he aged past 40. He had served one term as a deputy sheriff in Hemphill County in 1926 and 1927, and had not sought reappointment, not because he had done poorly, but because the paperwork required by the position irritated him more than the criminals had. He was the kind of man who paid his debts before he paid anything else, and who had been known, on more than one occasion, to pay other people's debts when the circumstances warranted it, and who never spoke of having done so afterward. He had come to Harlan Flats with a practical purpose. He was moving a small consignment of cattle, 12 head of mixed-breed stockers, that he had purchased at the Canadian auction barn and was delivering to a ranching operation northwest of town. Plates called so the Rafter 7, owned by a man named Ben Collier, who had agreed to buy the 12 head at $31 a head. He expected to complete the delivery the following morning, collect his payment, and be on his way north by early afternoon. He stabled the sorrel at the livery on the south end of town, paid for 2 nights' feed and stabling in advance, and walked up the main street to the Panhandle Hotel, where he took a single room on the second floor at 50 cents a night, left his saddlebags and bedroll, and came back down to find a meal. He ate at a counter seat in the Blue Mesa Cafe, a narrow lunch counter operation 2 doors from the hotel, where a woman named Dolores Vickers ran the grill and knew more about the internal condition of Harlan Flats than any single person in town had a right to know. He ordered beef stew and coffee and listened. He was not a man who gathered information by asking direct questions. He gathered it by being still and attentive in places where people talked, and people in small towns in distress talked about the things that were distressing them, because there was no relief in silence. Over the course of 40 minutes at that counter, he heard the names of 9 families whose farms were under foreclosure demand. He heard the name Elias Cord twice, once from a man 2 seats down who was discussing it with someone the way people discuss a fact they have accepted, and once from Dolores Vickers herself, who mentioned it in passing with a particular expression that said she had not accepted it and did not intend to. He did not ask questions that evening. He paid for his meal, left a dime on the counter for Dolores, and walked up to the bank building at the north end of the main street and stood outside it for a moment, in the late afternoon light, reading the notice board in the window. The notice board listed in typed text 4 parcels currently under foreclosure proceedings and 3 under formal demand. The entry for Section 14 read Cord E.H. Note demand issued 9/21/34. Arrears $1,240. Deadline 10/15/34. He read it once. Then he walked back to the hotel. In the morning, he asked Dolores over coffee and eggs a single question. He asked whether the Cord place east of town was the one with the cottonwoods along the creek. She said it was. He said, "Productive ground out that way." She said it was good ground, and that Elias Cord was a good man who had been farming it right since before his own oldest boy could walk. John Wayne drank his coffee and did not say anything else about it. He spent the morning making arrangements for the cattle he was bringing up from Canadian, hiring a hand from the livery to help him bring the 12 head in the following day. He ate lunch at the Blue Mesa again. In the afternoon, he walked to the courthouse and spent the better part of an hour in the county recorder's office, where a young woman named Patsy Drummond helped him look at the Section 14 plat and the recorded deed history, and he read what he needed to read and thanked Patsy and left. He had seen something the evening before, and it had stayed with him through the night and through the morning. He had seen it standing outside the bank, reading the notice board, though he had not fully identified what it was until later. He had spent time in this country across 20 years, and he understood the arithmetic of a wheat farm on the Panhandle at 1934 prices, and the arithmetic told him that $1,240 was not an insurmountable number for a working man with 400 productive acres of good ground and 15 years of demonstrated husbandry. It was a number that was insurmountable only because the mechanism had created a deadline, and the deadline had been placed at the worst possible point in the worst possible year, and the man on the other side of it had done nothing wrong and had nowhere left to go. The evening before the 10th of October, John Wayne sat in his hotel room with the lamp on and went through the contents of the leather money belt he wore under his vest when he was moving cattle money. He counted out what he had. He had come down from Canadian with the proceeds of a cattle sale he had completed there, a clean transaction involving 23 head that had returned him $980 above what he had paid for them. He had additional money from the previous quarter's freight work deposited at a bank in Amarillo, accessible by wire transfer to the First Consolidated Bank of Tascosa if he made the request by telephone before noon the following day. He sat with that arithmetic for a while. He was not a wealthy man. He was a man who had enough, which was different, and he had enough because he had spent 20 years not spending money that did not need to be spent. The amount he was considering spending now was significant. It would leave him lean for the winter months and would require him to defer a piece of equipment he had been planning to purchase in the spring. He thought about the cottonwoods along the creek and the entry on the notice board, and the expression on Dolores Vickers' face when she said Elias Cord was a good man. He did not agonize over it. It was not his nature to agonize. He made the decision, and then he lay down on the hotel bed and went to sleep. In the morning of October 9th, he was at the hardware store before it opened, waiting on the sidewalk when the owner, a man named Harv Belden, came to unlock the door at 7:30. Harv gave him a look that said he had seen men waiting on the sidewalk before, and they generally wanted something. John Wayne stepped inside and asked to use the telephone. Harv gestured to the counterphone and said there would be a 15-cent charge for a long-distance call, and John Wayne said that was fine. He telephoned the People's First Bank of Amarillo and spoke to a man named Arnold Greeley, whom he had dealt with before, and instructed Arnold Greeley to wire transfer the sum of $360 to an account in his name at the First Consolidated Bank of Tascosa in Harlan Flats. Same-day transfer, and to note on the wire that it was a personal funds transfer for John Wayne. Arnold Greeley asked him to confirm the amount in the destination bank and the receiving party name, and John Wayne confirmed all of it, and Arnold Greeley said he would have it done before noon. John Wayne thanked him, paid Harv Belden his 15 cents, and went to breakfast. He ate slowly. He was not a man who hurried his meals, and the meal in question was important to him in the way that meals eaten before a day's work are important to working men. They are the last quiet thing before the thing begins. He had fried eggs and toast and 2 cups of coffee, and he read the Harlan Flats Courier, which had been published the previous Thursday, and which contained on its front page below the fold a brief item about the county's current foreclosure situation that was written in the careful language of a paper that did not want to offend the bank's advertising account. He left the Blue Mesa at 8:45 and walked to the First Consolidated Bank of Tascosa. The bank opened at 9. He was the first person through the door. The interior of the First Consolidated Bank of Tascosa was a single room divided by a wooden and glass teller partition into a public lobby on the near side and a working area on the far side. There were two teller windows, both staffed. A young man named Earl Pressler was at the left window. A woman named Frances Alton was at the right. Behind the partition, visible through the glass, the branch manager, Douglas Fisk, sat at a desk positioned at a slight angle so that he could see both the teller windows and the door without turning his head. The room smelled of paper and wood polish and the faint mineral smell of old money. John Wayne walked to the right-hand window and told Frances Alton that he was expecting a wire transfer in his name, arriving before noon from the People's First Bank of Amarillo, and that he wanted to confirm it had arrived or would be arriving, and to confirm that he could access those funds in cash today. Frances Alton took his name and went to check the wire log. She came back and said the transfer had not yet arrived, but that same-day wires from Amarillo typically cleared by 10:30. Yes, once it cleared, he could access the funds in cash. He thanked her and said he would be back at 10:30. He came back at 10:35. The wire had cleared. He told Frances Alton that he wanted to withdraw $360 in cash, and he also wanted to count out the cash he was carrying in his money belt, $940, and he wanted all of it, $1,300 total, counted together on the counter in front of a witness, and he wanted Frances Alton to write a receipt for the total amount he was carrying when he left the teller window. Frances Alton gave him a careful look and then did what he asked. She counted the wire transfer funds out in front of him. He counted his belt money alongside it, and together, on the counter of window 2, at the First Consolidated Bank of Tascosa in Harlan Flats, Texas, on the morning of October 9th, 1934, they count out a total of $1,300 in cash, 650s, 45, 20, 75 ones, and a collection of 5s and 10s that made up the remainder. The bills lay on the wooden countertop in a weight that was not dramatic but was undeniable. Nobody in that room moved for a moment. Frances Alton wrote the receipt as requested and signed it and offered John Wayne a carbon copy. He folded it and put it in his vest pocket. Then he asked to see Douglas Fisk. Fisk had been watching from his desk since the moment John Wayne began the count, and he came around the partition himself rather than sending Frances to fetch him, which was his habit when he wanted to control a situation before it developed. He was a trim man in a banker's suit, with a small gray mustache, and the manner of a man who had cultivated patience to the point of making it look like something else. He recognized John Wayne the way most people in the Eastern Panhandle recognized him, not from a specific prior meeting necessarily, but from the general regional knowledge of who certain men were and what they represented. He said, "Mr. Wayne, what can I do for you this morning?" John Wayne said, "I want to look at the Cord note." Fisk's expression went through something and came out neutral. He said that the Cord note was not a matter of public record in the sense of being available for general inspection. John Wayne said, "I'm not the general public. I'm a man who has $1,300 in his pocket and who wants to know whether you will accept $1,240 of it in full settlement of the outstanding demand on Section 14, Elias Cord, today." The room was quiet. Earl Pressler at window 1 was pretending to work on something behind the counter. Frances Alton had gone still with the receipt book still in her hands. A man who had come in behind John Wayne and was standing at the deposit counter to the left had also stopped moving. Fisk looked at John Wayne for a moment, and then said that such a transaction would need to be verified and documented, and that he would need to speak with his principals in Amarillo. John Wayne said, "The note calls the full amount due by the 15th. Today is the 9th. I am offering to pay the full amount 6 days early. I don't believe that requires a call to Amarillo." Fisk looked at him again. He was not a stupid man. He understood that what was being offered to him was the resolution of a problem that his home office had told him to resolve, in a form that required nothing from him except the routine processing of a payoff and the release of a lien. He understood also that declining it on procedural grounds, while a man stood in his lobby with $1,300 in his pocket, was a position he could not explain to anyone, including himself. He said, "Come into my office." John Wayne followed him around the partition and sat in the wooden chair across from Fisk's desk. Fisk pulled the Cord file from a drawer, and he was not surprised to find that it contained everything relevant because Douglas Fisk was an organized man. The note, the two restructuring documents, the demand letter, the forbearance agreement of November 1933, the plat reference, the deed record. Fisk reviewed the payoff calculation, the principal balance, the accrued interest to the current date, the late fees authorized under the restructured agreement, and he wrote a number on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk. The number was $1,263.50. John Wayne looked at it for a moment. The late fees were $23.50 above the face amount of the demand. He said, "Is that the full amount to clear the note and release the lien?" Fisk said it was, with interest and fees to date. John Wayne reached into his vest and put the money on the desk. He counted out $1,263.50. He counted the 50 cents in coins from his trouser pocket. He placed the money in a stack on the corner of Fisk's desk, and he placed the receipt from Francis Alton beside it as a record of the bill's presence in the bank. He paid the full amount. Then he waited. Fisk looked at the money on his desk for a moment, and then he picked up his pen and began to write. He prepared a payoff receipt acknowledging receipt of $1,263.50 in full satisfaction of the outstanding demand on the Cord note at Section 14. He prepared a lien release document sufficient for filing at the county recorder's office. He prepared a letter on bank letterhead confirming that the note was paid in full and that no further obligation existed on the property. He signed all three documents. He pressed them under the desk's brass seal stamp. He handed them to John Wayne. John Wayne picked them up and looked at each one in turn, making sure they said what they needed to say. They did. He folded them once and put them in the inside pocket of his vest. He stood up. He said, "I'll need a receipt for the cash itself, signed and witnessed, noting the denominations." Fisk wrote a second receipt and called Francis Alton in to witness it, and Francis Alton signed it with the expression of a woman who was recording something she would think about later. John Wayne thanked Douglas Fisk. Fisk said, "Mr. Wayne, I want you to understand that the bank's position in these matters is," and John Wayne said, "I understand it fine," and walked out through the partition and across the lobby and out the front door of the First Consolidated Bank of Tascosa into the October morning. The man at the deposit counter, whose name was Harvey Crane, and who ran the feed store 2 blocks south, had watched all of this from the time John Wayne had entered until the time he walked out, and he had not completed his deposit. He stood at the deposit counter with his deposit slip still in his hand and looked at the door after it closed, and then looked at Francis Alton, who looked back at him with the receipt book still in her hands. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Harvey Crane put his deposit slip in his shirt pocket and walked out of the bank without completing his transaction. John Wayne went back to the Blue Mesa. He ordered a piece of apple pie and a cup of coffee. He sat at the counter and ate the pie slowly and read the rest of the Thursday Courier that he had not finished at breakfast. After he finished the pie, he put 2 dimes on the counter and left. He drove the farm truck. He had arranged to borrow it from the liveryman, a practical loan, east on the county road toward Section 14. The road was caliche gravel over hardpan and ran straight east for 7 miles before bending slightly north toward the canyon breaks. He drove it at a moderate speed with the window down, despite the October cold, and the land on either side of the road was flat and enormous, and the sky above it was the particular shade of pale blue that only appears over the panhandle in October when there is no dust in the air. The windbreak trees along the near farms were yellowing, and the stubble fields from the wheat harvest stood gray-brown in the light, and the whole landscape had the quality of something at rest. He turned in at the Cord property gate at a little after 11:30. The gate was a standard wire and post arrangement with the post painted white, which someone had repainted recently enough that it still looked fresh. The drive from the gate to the house was 300 yards across what had once been lawn grass and was now bare dirt packed by foot traffic and the occasional vehicle. The cottonwoods along the creek to the south were yellow gold and enormous, and cast a mottled shade in the late morning light. He stopped the truck at the edge of the yard. Elias Cord came out of the barn at the sound of the truck. He was in work clothes, canvas trousers and a collarless shirt and heavy boots, and he was carrying a length of trace chain from some repair he had been doing. And he walked toward the truck with the careful, unhurried movement of a man on his own land who is not expecting trouble, but is not ruling it out. He was 45 years old, slightly below average height, with the stocky, solid build of a man who had spent 25 years doing physical work, and his face carried the permanent, sun-weathered lines of that work and of some additional years of worry. He did not recognize John Wayne, who stepped out of the truck and came around the front of it and stopped a few feet away. Most people did not recognize John Wayne on sight. He was known by reputation, not by image. Elias said, "Help you with something?" John Wayne said. "Are you Elias Cord?" Elias said he was. John Wayne reached into the inside pocket of his vest and brought out the folded documents from Fisk's office. He unfolded them once and held them out. Elias Cord looked at the papers. He did not immediately take them. He read the top line of the first document, which said, "First Consolidated Bank of Tascosa, receipt of payment in full. Note secured by real property at Section 14. He read the top line of the second document, which said, "Lien release. Upon filing, this instrument releases all claims against the above described property." He looked up at John Wayne. John Wayne held the papers out until Elias took them. He did not understand what had just happened. He held the papers and looked at them and looked up again, and John Wayne was standing with his hands at his sides in the easy posture of a man who has completed a task and is not in a hurry. The October air moved between them. From somewhere in the barn behind Elias came the sound of a horse shifting its weight. Elias said, "I don't," and stopped. John Wayne said, "Your note is paid. The lien release needs to go to the county recorder's office. The third paper is the bank's letter confirming full payoff. Keep all through somewhere dry." Elias Cord looked at the papers in his hand. His jaw was set in a way that was not about strength, but about control. He was a man for whom asking for help was the last resort after all other resorts were gone. And he had reached that last resort and found the door closed. And now he was standing in his own yard holding 3 pieces of paper that represented the thing he had believed he was about to lose. He said, "I don't know how to. Who are you?" John Wayne said, "Nobody you know," he said. "I can pay this back. I need time, but I can." John Wayne said no. Elias Cord did not say anything. He held the papers and he did not say anything. And after a moment he looked away, toward the cottonwoods along the creek, and the expression on his face was not easily described. It was the expression of a man who has been holding himself together by main force for a very long time, and has just been told by the evidence in his own hands that he does not have to hold any longer. John Wayne waited a moment. Then he said, "The ground out here is good. You take care of it right." Elias Cord looked back at him. He said, "I have." He said it, quietly, as though it were the truest thing he knew. John Wayne said, "I know." He turned and walked back around the front of the truck and got in. Elias Cord stood in the yard with the papers in his hand and watched the truck move back down the drive toward the gate. He was still standing there when Clara came out of the house to see what had brought a stranger to their yard, and she saw Elias standing alone with papers in his hand and something in his posture that she had not seen in 2 years. And she came across the yard and took the papers from him and read them. And she read them again. And then she put her hand on his arm, and they stood there together in the October light, with the cottonwoods gold behind them, and the note paid, and the lien released, and 15 years of their life returned to them by a man they did not know, whose truck was already at the county road and turning west. Harvey Crane had gotten back to the feed store by noon and told his counter clerk, a young man named Bobby Sims, what he had seen at the bank. Bobby Sims told 2 customers that afternoon. By the time the Blue Mesa closed at 6 o'clock that evening, Dolores Vickers had heard the story from 3 separate sources and had added what she knew herself, which was that John Wayne had been in her cafe twice and had asked one question about Elias Cord's property and had not said another word about it afterward. By Thursday, the story had reached the Courier, where the editor, a man named Edmund Carr, wrote it up for the following week's edition in 4 careful paragraphs that named everyone except John Wayne, whom he described as a cattleman visiting from the Canadian River country, because he had asked John Wayne directly, and John Wayne had declined to be named. He completed the delivery of the 12 stockers to the Rafter 7 on the morning of October 10th, collected $31 per head from Ben Collier, shook Collier's hand, and rode north out of Harlan Flats on the sorrel horse at a walking pace, moving up the main street and out the north end of town without looking back. And that was the last time anyone in Harlan Flats saw him. The winter of 1934 to 1935 was hard. Most winters in the Panhandle were hard, and this one added to the usual cold a continuation of the dust conditions that had made the fall miserable. But the Cord place at Section 14 was a going operation, and Elias and Clara and Roy managed the winter with the deliberate economy of people who have survived worse and have reason to believe they will survive this. The root cellar docked. The animals were in the barn. The deed was clear. The following spring brought better prices. Not good prices. The recovery of the mid-1930 was gradual and uncertain, and wheat was still not where it had been, but better. The winter wheat of 1935 came in at 29 bushels per acre on 180 acres, and at 28 cents a bushel, it returned an operating margin that allowed Elias to pay the spring operating note and put $60 aside. The summer sorghum was fair. The stockers moved through the pens in September of 1935 at a price that was 40% higher than it had been the previous fall. And by November of 1935, Elias Cord had an account balance at the County Savings Institution in Harlan Flats of $230, which was the first positive balance he had carried since 1930. In the spring of 1936, he began making payments to a private account he had set up at the Harlan Flats Savings Institution under the notation JW, $25 a month, without ever having an address to send it to or any reasonable expectation of finding one. He kept making those payments for 8 years. By 1944, the account held $2,400, which was more than twice the original sum. And at that point, Elias instructed the savings institution to transfer the funds to a charitable account maintained by the county hospital for families without the means to pay medical costs. And he told the hospital's administrator that he was making the gift on behalf of a man from the Canadian River country, whose name he did not know. By the spring of 1938, the date by which the revised notes' original term would have concluded even had it not been paid off in 1934. The Cord operation had expanded to 510 acres through the purchase of an adjacent 80-acre parcel that came available at a reasonable price, and was running 50 head of stocker cattle in addition to the wheat and sorghum rotation. Clara had planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house that by that point was producing enough vegetables for the family through the summer and enough preserved goods to carry them well past Christmas. Roy was farming a section of his own 6 miles north and came back on weekends to help with the heavy work. Alice had married a man who ran a machinery dealership in Amarillo and came back to the farm twice a year with her 2 children. Thomas was at the agricultural college in Lubbock. June was finishing her last year of school in Harlan Flats and had told her mother that she intended to teach. Elias turned 50 that year. He looked, as Clara sometimes said, like a man who had earned every year of it and was not sorry about any of them. He worked the land with the same consistency he had always worked it, and the land returned the courtesy, and in the evenings he sat on the porch he had extended and improved, and looked west across the section toward the town lights and the darkness and sky above the cap rock, and felt, with a particular clarity, the weight of what had been nearly taken and what remained. He kept the 3 documents from Douglas Fisk's office in a cedar box on the high shelf in the bedroom closet. He had had them mounted on backing paper and covered with a glass frame, and then taken them down and put them back in the box, because mounting them felt like a celebration of something that had not been his to celebrate. They were someone else's act. He kept them because they were a record, and records mattered on a working farm. But he did not display them. He told Roy the story once, in full, in the summer of 1940, when Roy was 24 and had come over for a Sunday dinner, and the 2 of them were sitting on the porch in the early evening, while Clara and Roy's wife were inside. He told it plain, without embellishment, as a recounting of facts. Roy listened without interrupting. When Elias was done, Roy sat for a while and then said, "Did you ever find out who he was?" Elias said, "His name was John Wayne. Nobody told me more than that, and he didn't offer it." Roy said, "You never looked for him." Elias said, "He made it clear he didn't want to be looked for." They sat in silence for a while after that, and the evening light went gold on the wheat stubble fields, and the cottonwoods along the creek rustled in a small, clean wind, and neither of them said anything more about it. The First Consolidated Bank of Tascosa foreclosed on 29 of the 63 delinquent properties that autumn of 1934. The other 34 were resolved by various means over the following 18 months. Douglas Fisk retired from banking in 1948 and moved to Lubbock, where he died in 1961 at the age of 80. He had, in the years after that October morning, occasionally mentioned the event at the teller window to people he trusted, always with the same phrasing. "A man came in and paid another man's mortgage for no reason I could determine, and then he left." It was not quite right as a description, but it was Fisk had, and he offered it honestly. The Harlan Flats Courier ran its 4-paragraph item about the transaction in the October 18, 1934 edition. Edmund Carr kept a copy of that issue in a frame in his office for the remainder of his tenure at the paper until he retired in 1957. When his successor asked about the framed paper, Carr said it was the only story he had ever published that he was certain had improved something. By the summer of 1991, the property at Section 14 was operated by a man named David Cord, the son of Thomas, who had come back from Lubbock after college and taken over the operation from Elias' second son. The farm had grown through 3 subsequent land additions to 890 acres and was running a mixed wheat and sorghum operation with a commercial cattle backgrounding component that by 1991 was processing approximately 400 head per year. The cottonwoods along the creek had grown to an extraordinary size, and the oldest of them had a trunk diameter at chest height of nearly 4 feet, and the Cord children, who grew up on the farm in the 1970s and 1980s, had built a platform in the largest one that could be seen from the county road. David Cord had grown up hearing the story of October 1934 the way all the Cord children had grown up hearing it, as a family fact told plainly without theatrical weight, because that was how Elias had told it, and how Thomas after him had continued to tell it. The cedar box from the bedroom closet shelf had passed from Elias to Thomas and from Thomas to David, and David kept it on his own high shelf and periodically took it down and opened it and looked at the 3 documents inside: the payoff receipt, the lien release, and the bank letter on a first consolidated letterhead. All 3 were signed by Douglas Fisk. None of them bore the name of the man who had commissioned them. In the county recorder's office in Harlan Flats, in the deed records for Section 14, there is an entry dated October 10th, 1934, recording the filing of a lien release on the Cord property. The filing was made in person by a man identified in the recorder's handwritten log as Wayne J. Cattleman. Patsy Drummond, who had helped him read the plat records 2 days before, recognized him when he came in to file and asked him, in the directness of a young woman who has been thinking about something for 2 days, whether he was the one who had paid the mortgage. He said he had filed some papers. She said, "Is that a yes?" He looked at her for a moment with those deep-set eyes, and then said, "You filed them yourself. You can read what they say." He paid the filing fee, which was 25 cents, and left. Some men define the ground they stand on by how hard they hold it. Others define it by what they are willing to give away so that someone else might stand at all. Elias Cord held that ground for 31 more years, until he died in his sleep in the spring of 1965, at the age of 75, in the house he had built on the land he had worked, in the county that had nearly taken it from him, and had not, because one autumn morning a man from the Canadian River country walked into a bank in Harlan Flats and put his money on a stranger's table without being asked and without waiting to be thanked. And the cottonwoods Clara planted along the creek are still standing,